Eric Goodridge was standing in his daughter's apartment. It was the first time they were completely alone in more than 8 years. Brigitte had invited him to her apartment to talk. She wanted him to apologize to her for all the pain he had put her through. She wanted him to acknowledge that what he had done was wrong, but Eric would do no such thing. Instead, he told her he had done nothing wrong, and that he had only done what all fathers do to their daughters, and it was out of love. But Brigitte, now aged 26, knew better. A loving father would never have done what he had done to her, or to any other little girl for that matter. And the more he spoke, the more irritated she became. He had to be stopped, or he would do it again. There was no turning back. She knew what she had to do. Brigitte Harris was born on June 6, 1981, on the back seat of a taxicab outside a hospital in Staten Island, New York, to Lucy Ann Harris and Eric Goodridge, both immigrants from the West African nation, Liberia. At first, Eric did not claim Brigitte as his child, and so she ended up with her mother's surname, Harris. Just like her birth on that back seat, Brigitte's early life would turn out to be less than ideal. When Eric Goodridge met Lucy Ann Harris, she already had 2 sons. The couple, who never married, eventually had 2 children together, Brigitte and her older sister Carleen. By the time Brigitte was born, Eric, who had grown discontented in the relationship, had already left Lucy Ann. Young Brigitte and her siblings lived with their mother in an apartment in Park Hill until she left them to attend her grandfather's funeral in Liberia, but never came back. The children were left without proper care and ended up in the foster care system, moving from home to home. Then, in 1984, the man who had initially denied Brigitte as his daughter came to her rescue. It was then that Eric Goodridge took in Brigitte, who was almost 3 years old, her sister and 2 half-brothers, to live with him and his wife in Bayshore, Long Island. Things were not about to get better for young Brigitte. This home was far from being peaceful and loving. In fact, the police were called to the house multiple times because of reports of domestic violence, but Eric was never arrested or charged. He drank heavily, and it was soon after Brigitte went to live with him that her years of torment at the hands of her father began. Eric Goodridge was no stranger to the immigrant community in Staten Island, New York. He had migrated to the United States in the early 70s and was a known and well-respected businessman. Since living in the Big Apple, he had started multiple businesses, including an import-export shipping company, a record store, as well as a limo and taxi agency. But one thing those who knew him may not have known about him was that he had dark desires and an attraction to young girls. And what's more is that he didn't have to leave the comfort of his home to feed his twisted appetite. According to Brigitte, by the age of 3, her father, who was supposed to be her protector, had her doing things to him and was doing things to her that no toddler should ever experience. In 1990, Eric headed back to Africa to take up a temporary job as an official for the Transportation Authority in Liberia, leaving the children with his wife. The job lasted longer than he anticipated, and his wife eventually filed for a divorce. Brigitte and her siblings were then sent to live with Eric's mother and sister in Providence, Rhode Island. This chapter of Brigitte's life would not be without more pain and suffering. Her grandmother was a crass woman who lacked sensitivity. The children endured horrible and abusive treatment under her roof. They were beaten and treated like slaves while their cousins relaxed and lounged around. There was also mention of Brigitte being beaten so severely by her grandmother that her skin tore and pepper sauce poured in her wounds. According to Brigitte, at that time, she was also repeatedly molested by one of her cousins. This chapter ended in 1994 when Brigitte and her siblings went to Liberia to live with their mother. An excited 12-year-old Brigitte, who barely had any memories of her mother since she had left her so young, was eager to reunite with her. Brigitte's loveless childhood had caused her to become a withdrawn and unhappy child, and despite the fact that she had been told that her mother had abandoned her, she saw her mother as the one who would give her the love that she so desperately needed. Sadly, things don't always go as planned. The love and care that Brigitte expected from her mother, she never received, and it soon became clear to Brigitte that her mother didn't care about her. When she opened up to her mother about the sexual abuse she had suffered at the hands of her father, her mother told a pastor, and they both confronted Eric. But of course, he denied it. Her mother accepted Eric's word and did nothing to help her. While in Liberia, Brigitte also got sick with malaria, landing her in the hospital for 2 weeks, and her mother didn't even visit because of a church revival she had to attend. It was her father who came for her once again, and he did not hesitate to pick up just where he had left off. For the 6 years that followed, Brigitte would live a life woven with verbal and sexual abuse, traveling between the United States and Liberia, longing for a chance to live a normal life, which she thought meant a life without her father, and she would get that chance. At 17 years old, Brigitte went back to the United States. At first, she moved around among family members and eventually ended up in a women's shelter. For years, she struggled, but she had managed to lock her father out of her life. In 2006, Brigitte got a chance to turn a new leaf. She got a job as a security guard at JFK and finally had a place of her own. But in early 2007, Brigitte received an unwelcomed call. It was from the very source of the nightmares that still haunted her at night, Eric. She told him never to call her phone again. Later that year, Brigitte was settling in her new life when one day out of the blue she received a call from her sister Carlene telling her that Eric was back. His health was failing him and he had to return to the United States to seek medical treatment. But not only was he back, he was staying in Staten Island with Carlene and her daughters. Carlene told Brigitte their father wanted to talk with them. Eric, now 55, according to Carlene, wanted to make amends. She said she had forgiven him and that Brigitte should too. Brigitte agreed to visit her sister's apartment to hear him out. As Brigitte entered Carlene's apartment, she observed one of her nieces sitting on Eric's lap as he would have her do in her younger years, which was usually followed by things she didn't even want to remember. This led to a heated argument between her and Carlene. Brigitte was even more enraged when she heard that Eric was planning to take two of Carlene's young daughters with him back to Liberia. She could not understand how Carlene would even consider letting her daughters return to Liberia with this man, knowing the hurt he had put them both through when they were children. Had she lost her mind? Brigitte knew she couldn't let that happen. Another generation would not suffer at the hands of Eric Goodridge.
911, what's your emergency?
A young woman's voice could be heard on the line. She said, "Somebody's bleeding to death at an apartment on 16th Street. Please send an ambulance over." When law enforcement and the paramedics arrived at the apartment in Far Rockaway, the door was left wide open. At first glance, it didn't seem like anyone was around, but soon they saw a man lying handcuffed on the ground with a towel stuffed in his mouth. The man was dead, and it was obvious that this was foul play. And the perpetrator was nowhere in sight. But upon closer inspection, one thing that was not quite as obvious was that something was missing. His penis had not only been severed, but it was missing. By now, it was evident that the young woman who had called the 911 dispatcher to request paramedics at the location was the key to understanding what had taken place and the circumstances that led to the castration of the victim that lay dead on the floor. But how had things escalated to this point? Saturday, July 28, 2007 was a rather hot day. The air seemed to stand still in Queens County, New York. It was the day when Brigitte agreed to meet with her father, Eric Goodridge. That day, two people entered the apartment on 69th Street, but only one would come out alive. According to Brigitte, she agreed to meet with her father because she wanted him to admit to what he had done to her and seek help. But instead, he denied ever doing anything wrong and asked her without feeling how she could remember that when she was only 3. Brigitte also tried desperately to convince Eric not to take Carlene's 2 daughters with him to Liberia, but it was evident he had already made up his mind. This angered Brigitte. She knew that if she didn't stop him, her nieces would suffer like she did, and she could not allow this to happen. That's when things got physical. The two tussled, and eventually she managed to overpower him and used a pair of handcuffs to restrain him. To keep him quiet, she stuffed a towel in his mouth. Then she ran to another room and got a scalpel she had purchased on eBay. She pulled down his pants and then began the removal. When she was done severing the object of destruction, she put it on the stove and turned on the flame. But in a split second, she had a change of mind. She quickly wrapped it in a paper towel and bolted. It wasn't long after that she called the 911 dispatcher. In one of the conversations with the dispatcher, Brigitte asked if Eric was alive. The dispatcher told her to turn herself in, and she said she would. Standing just minutes from the police station, she made a call to her sister Carlene, telling her that she had cut it off. She had done it. This left Carlene rather confused. She told Brigitte not to turn herself in because if she did, she would never see her again. Carlene told Brigitte to stay where she was and that she would come to meet her. As Brigitte waited, she made her way onto the nearby boardwalk where she tossed the penis below. It has never been found. When Carleen eventually arrived and saw Brigitte, she was concerned about her sister's state of mind and checked Brigitte into the psych ward at the hospital. Meanwhile, investigators worked tirelessly to find enough evidence to make an arrest, and they did. 2 weeks after the deed was done, Brigitte was arrested as she was being released from the hospital. When the story about the young woman who had cut off her father's penis, killing him in the process, hit the headlines, the question that plagued many people's minds was, why? Why hadn't Brigitte reported it to the authorities instead of taking matters into her own hands? According to Brigitte, she considered making a report to the police, but the statute of limitations had passed. It was just too late. Eric hadn't touched her since she was 17 when she fought him off in their last encounter while in Liberia. Had Brigitte been the only victim? No, she was not. Her sister Carleen soon went public, sharing her story as well. Carleen had learned to live with her trauma. She had managed to pack it away to live her life, but Brigitte, on the other hand, still struggled, and a lot of her anger was expressed through the music she was listening to. It was evident that her act of violence towards her father was a cry for help. Brigitte still maintains that it was never her intention to take her father's life. She only wanted to stop him from doing what he had done to her to anyone else. It was revealed that the towel stuffed in Eric's mouth had limited his ability to breathe, which led to his death. Brigitte did the crime, and so the prosecution was adamant that she should do the time. However, some jurors were so moved by Brigitte's story, and though they acknowledged that what she had done was wrong, many of them sent letters to the judge asking for leniency for Brigitte, for they believed she had suffered enough. During the trial, Brigitte received an outpouring of support and sympathy from people all over the world. Brigitte Harris was convicted of second-degree manslaughter in the murder and mutilation of her father in 2009 and was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison, but was released after serving 3 years.